Recently, we as a species have developed a tendency. When we are faced with an unpleasant fact, an unpalatable truth, what we do is we redefine words. And then we feel good with ourselves. We feel ego-syntonic. So many young people tell me that oral sex is not sex. Really? Then why is it called oral sex? Sex. Similarly, many victims of abuse tell me that reactive abuse is not abuse. Really? Then why is it called abuse? It's called abuse because it is abuse. There is no excuse for abuse. No form of abuse is justified ever, not even as a reaction to abuse. So if you're abusing someone because they had abused you, you're an abuser as well. End of story. Not comfortable, not nice to hear. You hate me for saying this, but your abusive behavior within an abusive relationship renders you an abuser too. However, today's video deals with the science of reactive abuse. What is it that we know about this type of behavior, and is it linked to other forms of aggression, emotionality, cognitions, and so on and so forth? My name is Sam Vaknin. I'm the author of Malignant Self-Love, Narcissism Revisited, the first book ever on narcissistic abuse. I'm also a professor of psychology. Reactive abuse is, of course, a form of what we call reactive aggression. Reactive aggression involves an emotional response, and the emotional response tends to be targeted towards a perceived source of distress or frustration. Sometimes, when the perceived source cannot be attacked directly, the aggression is displaced onto other people and objects. When the disturbing, frustrating, abusive, traumatizing agent, person, object cannot be tackled directly, the aggression is displaced. And so aggression is, we know today, socially learned. It's not innate. You're not born with aggression. Aggression, or at least aggressive behavior, is socially learned, and it is a reaction to frustration. The frustration-aggression hypothesis is a theory first proposed in 1939 by John Dollard and his colleagues, and they suggested that frustration always produces an aggressive urge, and that aggression is always a result of prior frustrations. Neil Miller, one of the proponents of this theory, noted later that frustration can lead to several kinds of actions. But he maintained that the urge to become aggressive is more dominant when the thwarting or the abusive behavior or the frustrating behavior continues. In other words, the more you're exposed to abuse, the more you're exposed to trauma, the more you're exposed to frustration and thwarting and obstruction, the more likely you are to become aggressive. In 1989, the psychologist Leonard Berkowitz proposed that the frustration must be decidedly unpleasant in order to evoke an aggressive urge. So the frustration-aggression or aggression-frustration hypothesis is the foundational cornerstone to explaining reactive abuse. When we analyze the phrase reactive abuse, we notice, of course, that there is a reaction. What is a reaction? It's a response to a stimulus. But a stimulus can also inhibit action, can prevent action. For example, the freeze response is a form of inhibition. Inhibition brought on by a perceived, real or imagined, anticipated or present threat. To summarize, a reaction could be inhibitory or disinhibitory. A reaction could be action, could result in action, or could result in freezing. There is something called reactive inhibition. Reactive inhibition is a part of a larger theory called Hull's mathematico-deductive theory of learning. And this kind of reaction this kind of inhibition, the reactive inhibition, is a tendency for response magnitude to decrease with increasing practice or with fatigue. Hull's theory of learning predicts that reactive abuse is likely to decrease with time, not to increase with time, as the victim is exposed to additional abuse time and again. As the victim practices reactive abuse, fatigue sets in and desensitization. The victim gets habituated, gets used to the abuse, and the incidence of reactive abuse declines. There is a distinction, of course, between reactive and endogenous. Reactive is associated with or originates from a stimulus or some situation. We react, it's a response to something external, it's exogenous. For example, you could have a psychotic episode that is secondary to a traumatic or otherwise stressful event in your life. And that is the example of a reactive process in your psyche, in your psychology. It would be considered reactive because it is the outcome of something that emanated mainly from the outside. Endogenous episodes are unrelated to any specific triggers. They emanate and they come from the inside. They are the outcome of totally internal processes which are divorced from reality. And so reactive abuse, of course, is a kind of exogenous reaction. It's an exogenous response. It's a response to something outside. There's an abuser, there's a victimizer, there's a traumatizer, there's a perpetrator, and there is a reaction which constitutes abusive behavior, but still is responsive, is a response to something. There's a whole theory known as reactance theory. It's a model of human behavior, and it states that in response to a perceived threat, for example, threat to behavioral freedom or loss of behavioral freedom, a person experiences psychological reactance, or more simply, reactance. In other words, reactance theory postulates that abuse, trauma, all these experiences actually limit your freedom. They're perceived as kind of suffocating, incarcerating, constricting. Your behaviors, the menu of behaviors available to you is much more limited. There is a restriction or a threat to or a loss of behavioral freedom, and you react to this. Then this is known as reactance. It's a motivational state characterized by distress, anxiety, resistance, and the desire to restore the lost behavioral freedom or the restricted behavioral freedom. According to this model, when people feel coerced into a certain behavior, they react against this coercion, often by demonstrating an increased preference for the behavior that is restrained. They may perform this behavior opposite to that desire. This was first proposed by Jack Brehm, B-R-E-H-M, in 1966. We can use reactance theory to make sense of reactive abuse. The abuser restricts the behavioral freedom of the victim in highly specific ways. The abuser, for example, makes demands or punishes for highly specific behaviors. And then the victim reacts. There is a reactance, and the victim emphasizes these limited, proscribed, forbidden behaviors and actually enacts them. When the abuser tells you, don't do this, you should not do this, you're not allowed to do this, your tendency is to spite the abuser and actually do it. Exactly the behavior The abuser tells you, if you behave this way, I'm going to punish you. This provokes you to behave exactly this way. And this is reactance. It may be perceived as abuse by an outside observer, but actually it's the abuser that is setting the terms of this interchange. And so reactive abuse, to some extent, is a response to a stimulus, the stimulus being abuse. But in some ways, it's also a reactance behavior, a kind of defiant behavior. It's a form of defiance. And a third aspect of reactive abuse is that it may be a form of reaction formation. In psychoanalytic theory, reaction formation is a defense mechanism in which unacceptable or threatening unconscious impulses are denied, and they're replaced in consciousness with their opposite. So, for example, to conceal an unconscious prejudice, an individual may preach tolerance. To deny feelings of rejection, a mother may be overindulgent and overprotective towards the child. If you're a latent homosexual, you will become homophobic. It's like your conscious behavior denies the unconscious reality. And this is known as reaction formation. Through the symbolic relationship between the unconscious wish and its opposite, the outward behavior provides a disguised outlet for the tendencies that it seems to oppose. Reactive behavior can be conceptualized in these terms. The abuser provokes in you aggression, hatred, negative affects. These kind of emotions, these kind of motivations, this kind of drive is alien to you. You reject it. You don't want to be aggressive. You don't want to be hateful. You don't want to be violent. So you reject it. But you reject it by actually engaging in behaviors that affirm these unconscious constructs or processes that the abuser has triggered in you. It's a kind of inverted reaction formation. In classic reaction formation, the behavior denies the impulse. The behavior denies the drive. The behavior denies the internal psychological processes. It's the opposite of the unconscious impulse that is denied. Whereas in this type of reaction formation, inverted reaction formation, the behavior externalizes the unconscious impulse that had been triggered in you by the abuser. It expresses it in a way. So let's go back to Hull's theory of learning. It's a mathematical system, actually, of learning. A mathematical system that conceptualizes learning or analyzes learning. And it is based on classical and instrumental conditioning. It contains numerous postulates and corollaries to explain highly specific behaviors, and so one of the most complex theories in psychology. And there's a major emphasis on need reduction. What the theory says is that learning depends on, crucially, need reduction. First, you need to reduce your neediness. You need to cater to your needs, or you need to suppress them somehow. The needs need to go away, and only then you're open to learning. Learning is also associated with the building up of habit strength by contiguous reinforcement. In other words, if you're exposed to the same behavior time and again and again and again, this creates a habit, the habit becomes strong, and this leads to learning. And there is extinction of learning brought about by non-reinforced repetition of responses, and forgetting as a process of decay with the passage of time. Clark Hull came up with this theory. And so when we apply Hull's theory of learning to reactive abuse, we see all these elements in play. There is habituation. There is exposure to abuse, repeated abuse, contiguous abuse, unrelenting and unending loop of abuse. This creates a habit. The habit becomes stronger and stronger, and there's learning involved. Ironically, the learning is to not react. So it reduces reactive abuse. Finally, the reactive abuse becomes extinct, not because of non-reinforced repeated responses, but it becomes extinct because of habituation. There is something called reaction potential. It's the probability that a stimulus will facilitate a particular response. It is a multiplication of an organism's habit strength and drive strength. The habit strength, as I said, is a hypothetical construct. It reflects learning strength, and it varies with the number of reinforcements, the amount of reinforcement, the interval between stimulus and response, the interval between response and reinforcement, etc., etc. This was all described in 1943. It's kind of adjunct behaviorism. But habituation can lead to extinction. This is where I disagree with Hull's theory of learning. Hull's theory of learning says the more habituated you are, the more you learn. And I say, yes, of course, that's one possibility. But it could also happen that the more habituated you are, the more you get used to the stimulus, the more desensitized you are to the stimulus, and the habit causes extinction of behavior, behavioral extinction and forgetting. So this is a kind of modification of Hull's theory. In his theory, drive strength is the intensity of a drive, and it is related to the number of hours of deprivation of a need. But this can be equally applied to reactive abuse. The abuser deprives you of your needs. This enhances your drive. The drive causes you to behave. But at the same time, you get habituated. You develop a habit. The abuse becomes familiar. It desensitizes you. And then you give up on any kind of response. It's not that you freeze as much as you avoid. You shun the abuser. You walk away. You ignore the abuse. And the frequency and incidence of reactive abuse declines. That's the theory behind reactive abuse. I do not condone reactive abuse because it is abuse. It's very easy to become a narcissist in the presence of a narcissist. It's very easy to develop psychopathic traits such as defiance and recklessness in the presence of a psychopath. It's very easy to get infected. It's contagious. Narcissism and psychopathy are contagious. Don't let yourself. Don't stoop to their level. Don't become them. Maintain your dignity, your integrity, and your identity by avoiding reactive abuse.